Hey everybody, I wanted to go over with you today a short mini lecture about the Progressive Era, and in this lesson we're going to be learning about three presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson. We're going to learn about how it all started with a group of journalists called the MUCKRAKERS, that it dealt with people reforms, business controls, some issues with improvements for minority and labor, also conservation efforts, and finally efforts to maintain U.S. power in the world. So let's get started so we can get through. So as I said, the Progressive Era started with a group of journalists called the Muckrakers, and this is the list of those journalists. We're going to learn all about those in our lessons. That's one of our learning tasks, is to learn about the Muckrakers and what they were trying to achieve, what their particular reforms were. And these journalists made it a real goal to go out and find out what was wrong with business, to find out what was wrong with certain laws, with government structures, with social services, and to expose this in the newspapers and shame the people into changing their systems. So the Muckrakers were very, very influential on our very first progressive president, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt loved to read, and he read every day. And one of the famous stories about Teddy Roosevelt has to do with Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was one of the very first photojournalists, and he took pictures of the tenements and exposed the very awful living conditions of people. And Teddy Roosevelt looked at the photographs and read Jacob Riis's book. He found where he lived and he went to see him, and he knocked on the door, and this is all before Teddy Roosevelt became president. Knocked on the door and he said, "Hello, my name is Teddy Roosevelt. I love your book. I've read it. I think what's going on is terrible, and I'm here to help." And who would have ever thought that Teddy Roosevelt would one day be president and be able to actually start a reform effort called the Progressive Era? So the Progressive Era, the name Progressive, comes from a political party that was around during that time, and this was a third party that wanted to really make some changes, and people at the time felt like that the Republican and the Democratic parties weren't really doing what was necessary to make changes that were really, really needed. So a third party was formed, and over time the party became more popular, and people were getting elected at local levels for these different reform types. So Teddy Roosevelt is not a member of the Progressive Party. He's a member of the Republican Party, but he took on a lot of progressive ideas, and he did want to make changes. So I took the liberty of making all of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did for consumer protection or people reforms in blue. Taft's efforts are in yellow. Wilson's efforts are in green, and this goes throughout the whole presentation. And the idea is here that you can see what each president achieved, and that will be good for making comparisons and understanding who did what and how good of a job they actually did in embracing reform. Teddy Roosevelt is big on consumer protection. He gets his administration to try and protect our food with these two acts. This one, Mueller versus Oregon, is all about women's health in the workplace, and it's actually a Supreme Court case that ruled that women who were expecting babies needed some protections in the workplace. William Howard Taft, he did not have any real consumer protection reforms, but Woodrow Wilson has a bunch of them. We have 4 amendments passed during his presidency. We also have the beginnings of a Federal Reserve System, which was to make banking more stable for people. And then the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act was intended to stop child labor. However, it was pretty quickly overturned by the Supreme Court. Going forward, so corporation control was also a big goal of the progressives. And I want to stop here and just mention that Teddy Roosevelt had his reform effort called the 3 C's and an L. So he had consumer protection, corporation control, he had conservation, and he had labor. And so that's where I'm getting these terms. I didn't come up with these all by myself, but it's easier to put things in this context or framework to be able to make these comparisons between the three presidents and see the progression. So as I said, Teddy Roosevelt starts off great with consumer protection. Taft doesn't really embrace it. Wilson kind of brings it back. Wilson is a Democratic president, by the way. Taft is also a Republican. Corporation control was another goal of Teddy Roosevelt, which will be embraced by the other two presidents to some degree. He was big into trying to break up the railroad trust to keep those railroads from price gouging people and also to make them obey certain standards. Taft was called the trust buster because he brought 90 lawsuits against trust during his presidency. This is the thing that he does the best with. The Mann-Elkins Act is another law that attempts to control the railroads or regulate them. Standard Oil is finally broken up into smaller companies to prevent monopolization of this product. Oil, which was 99% of it was controlled by Standard Oil. However, Taft goes a little bit in the reverse here. This is why these two terms are red, is because he doesn't really stay true to corporation control here by letting the tariff go up. And the tariff, as we know, we have learned, protects the businessman by protecting sales at home against foreign competition. It makes the foreign good more expensive so that people will want to buy the American-made good. Then another thing that happens that really shows there's so much more work to be done as far as labor issues is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and we're going to do an investigation into that during Taft's presidency, during this lesson. President Wilson, he also then lowers the tariff with the Underwood tariff, brought it down quite a bit. He set up a Federal Trade Commission to investigate unfair business practices. He will also institute another Clayton Antitrust Act. So, going forward, minorities and labor, Teddy Roosevelt had 3 C's and an L. And so let's talk about the labor reforms and the minority progress during the presidencies. Teddy Roosevelt stepped in a coal strike in, I believe it was Pennsylvania, in the anthracite coal strike, and he mediated this strike, and he got these workers a raise and a lower workday. He's the very first president to basically get involved and step in on the side of labor and try to get something good for them. Another cool story about Teddy Roosevelt was that he was the first president to ask an African American to come to dinner. He received a lot of criticism for this, but he was the first one to do so. But he didn't really push or embrace any other minority reforms. William Howard Taft, he didn't really embrace any type of minority or labor reform. In fact, things are so bad for our blacks in the South that they are migrating north as quickly as possible, and we saw a little chart on that on one of our other lessons in the imperial era. Wilson, during Wilson's time, also no progression at all for minority groups. There will be another organization created for to promote reforms for African Americans called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by a man named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey said that basically things are so bad here, we just basically need to go back to Africa. And another thing that is, unfortunately, I've left off this chart for some reason, is that we have the rise of the NAACP also during this time, which is a major organizational group that continues to fight for the rights of minorities and for protections. So going forward, let's talk about conservation. Teddy Roosevelt was the very first president to embrace conservation efforts but he was a little bit limited. He was a friend to John Muir, who was a conservationist who helped found the Sierra Club. But Teddy Roosevelt believed that we should live in harmony with nature but still be able to use it. And this is a process or a policy called multiple resource management. Taft, when he becomes president, kind of goes in the opposite direction again with a controversy over some public lands that were basically a group of businessmen came in and they wanted to drill on these public lands, and so you have this controversy on, whether or not we should allow that. Should we allow business to come in and have any access to public lands if they're willing to pay money? And so the issue is conservation. Do we conserve lands at all costs? Or do we try to reclaim lands, that we can? If we have some portion of land that we can, go to, it might be dry and we can put water on it. Can we reclaim that land? So this was a big controversy and scandal during Taft's presidency. And then President Wilson's presidency, they do pass the National Parks Act, which creates Grand Canyon and many other wonderful national parks that we all enjoy now. Finally, last area of focus is power in the world. So what did these presidents do after the imperial era to maintain the United States' power in the world at a time when we have a lot of nations who are fighting for dominance? And of course, we're leading into World War I, in which some of that dominance will be sorted out, unfortunately, through war and death and destruction. Teddy Roosevelt was a major nationalist. He believed in getting his way and promoting the American way around the world. He followed something called big stick policy. He based this on an African proverb: speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far. So Teddy Roosevelt was the type of person who liked to be in everybody's business. He wanted to make the United States even greater than it was, more controlling, more influence all over the world. He picked up the canal project that had been begun by the French in Central America. They were actually trying to build it through Nicaragua, and that was a bad building place. Teddy Roosevelt got involved in a revolution down in Colombia, helped the Panamanians get their independence, and he then got permission to build a canal through Panama, which is where the engineers said it was the best place to build. This is probably one of the most symbolic events in United States history to show how the United States wanted to establish its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, is by building that Panama Canal, and did give us a lot of control and power. Roosevelt, corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, he said that basically we were going to protect Latin American nations on our side of the world in the Western Hemisphere. He got involved with immigration. He wanted to prevent the Japanese from immigrating to the United States in large numbers. He went over, he talked to them, shook their hand, made a gentleman's agreement that they would try to limit immigration. And then finally he got involved with the Japanese-Russian war that was going on at the time and mediated a peace treaty. He did get the Nobel Peace Prize for it. However, the Japanese come away from this treaty feeling like they were kind of slighted in a way, because they were actually winning that war, and if Teddy Roosevelt would not have stepped in, they probably would have won and got a lot more territory out of it than they ended up getting. So the Japanese come away from the Treaty of Portsmouth with kind of a grudge against the United States, and also the gentleman's agreement doesn't help that any either, and so that's going to propel us towards Pearl Harbor. Taft used something called dollar diplomacy, which is what we still use today, where we hand money out to countries to get them to do our bidding and support our policies. We saw examples of that in our last lesson on imperialism. And then finally, President Wilson doesn't really want to be involved in the world because World War I is coming. We're becoming even more isolationist, and so he is not able to really get involved with any type of efforts to promote America, and eventually he will have to face the fact that we are going to be in a world war for the first time. So I hope that this helped you learn a little bit about the Progressive Era and gave you a framework for learning about what it was all about. What were we progressing with? We had people reforms, we had business controls, we had some minority and labor advances, some but not all, conservation efforts, and then American power in the world extended for some presidents. So I thank you for tuning in this time again, and I'll see you in the next lecture.